What kind of doctor would risk his own life, even inject himself with a patient's infected blood, just to prove a theory? It happened in Havana, Cuba, at the dawn of the 20th century, when yellow fever was one of the deadliest mysteries on Earth. Before we dive in, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know who's joining this journey. Now, let's begin the story of courage, sacrifice, and discovery. The tale of the Yellow Fever Commission, the doctors who gambled with death, and the moment science turned the tide against one of history's most feared diseases. At the turn of the 20th century, Havana was in turmoil. The Spanish-American War had ended, and Cuba was under U.S. military administration. Disease, not gunfire, had become the occupying army's greatest enemy. Yellow fever stalked the city, killing soldiers and civilians alike. Its unpredictable strikes, high mortality, and mysterious transmission had made it one of the most feared diseases in the Americas. It was in this atmosphere that the United States Army Yellow Fever Commission, led by Major Walter Reed and including James Carroll, Aristides Agramont, and Jesse William Lazear, began its work in 1900. Their mission was to resolve a puzzle that had eluded physicians for decades. How was yellow fever spread? What they uncovered in Havana would alter the course of global public health. Their experiments demonstrated beyond doubt that the Aedes aegypti mosquito was the carrier of the disease. This confirmed the long-dismissed hypothesis of Cuban physician Carlos J. Finley, who had argued as early as 1881 that mosquitoes transmitted yellow fever. The Commission's work also disproved the prevailing fomite theory, which held that contaminated bedding, clothing, or other objects carried the infection. The dramatic part of the story, and the one that has often been retold in ways that blur fact and legend, involves self-experimentation. Members of the Commission put their own lives at risk. James Carroll deliberately allowed an infected mosquito to bite him. He developed a severe, though non-fatal, case of yellow fever. Jesse Lazear was also bitten, became ill, and died within weeks. These acts of personal risk gave the Commission's findings a tragic gravity that underscored their scientific importance. Yet there is an important correction to make. In Havana, the Commission conducted blood inoculation experiments by injecting volunteers with blood drawn from acutely ill yellow fever patients, and later with filtered serum to test whether the infectious agent passed through filters that retained bacteria. These injections were carried out on recruited volunteers, not on the Commission members themselves. Written contracts, rare for medical research at the time, were prepared in both Spanish and English, offering compensation and explaining the risks. Nowhere in Havana's verified record is there evidence of a doctor injecting himself with a patient's blood in order to prove a point. That exact act belongs to another story, in another country, and with another disease. In 1885, in Lima, Peru, medical student Daniel Alcides Carrion injected himself with material from a patient suffering from verruga peruana, or Peruvian wart. He developed the deadly acute form of Oroya fever and died, thereby proving that the acute and chronic phases were manifestations of a single disease, now called Carrion's disease. His act became legendary in medical history, but it took place in Peru, not Havana. Havana's story is different, though no less dramatic. It is the story of mosquito bite experiments, of blood inoculations into volunteers under carefully controlled conditions, of the death of Clara Moss, a U.S. nurse who volunteered and succumbed, and of the massive mosquito control campaign led by Major William C. Gorgas that eradicated urban yellow fever in Havana by the end of 1901. The Havana experiments were among the first to use formal written consent for human research subjects. They established that the infectious agent of yellow fever circulated in blood, was smaller than bacteria, and was transmitted by mosquitoes. Most importantly, they laid the foundation for modern vector control, a strategy that would later prove decisive during the building of the Panama Canal. Thus, when one speaks of the doctor who injected himself with a patient's blood, it is historically accurate to say that this was Carrion in Lima, not Reed, Carroll, or their colleagues in Havana. In Havana, the acts of self-experimentation were mosquito bites, not injections. What followed there was a public health triumph that changed history. When Walter Reed and his colleagues arrived in Havana in 1900, they were stepping onto ground that had already been seeded with a remarkable but widely disregarded idea. Nearly 2 decades earlier, in 1881, a Cuban physician named Carlos Finley had stood before the Academy of Sciences in Havana and proposed that yellow fever was not spread by contaminated clothing or direct human contact, as most experts believed, but by a mosquito. This suggestion, at the time, was extraordinary. Germ theory was only beginning to gain acceptance. Louis Pasteur had shown the role of microbes in fermentation and disease. Robert Koch had identified the anthrax bacillus. But yellow fever did not fit the new models neatly. No bacterium could be isolated from its victims. The disease seemed to strike with suddenness, rage through a population, then disappear. Its irregular patterns baffled those who tried to apply the emerging logic of microbiology. Finley, born in 1833 in Puerto Príncipe, today Camagüey, had been educated in Europe and the United States before returning to Cuba to practice medicine. He was an observant clinician and a relentless thinker. In his Havana practice and in conversations with colleagues, he pondered the peculiarities of yellow fever outbreaks. He noted how newcomers to Havana, immigrants, sailors, soldiers, were far more likely to contract the disease than long-term residents, who often possessed a degree of immunity. He observed how the illness waxed and waned with the seasons, and he considered the strange clustering of cases, often tied to particular neighborhoods. His insight was bold. An insect must be carrying the disease. More specifically, he singled out the Aedes aegypti mosquito, a species abundant in Havana's climate, known for breeding in water-filled containers close to human dwellings. Finley reasoned that the mosquito, by feeding on the blood of a yellow fever patient, could acquire the agent of the disease and pass it to the next person it bit. In 1881, at the International Sanitary Conference convened in Washington, D.C., Finley formally presented his theory. He argued that yellow fever could only be transmitted when a mosquito that had bitten a patient subsequently bit a healthy person. This would explain the patchy distribution of cases, the difficulty of reproducing the disease through exposure to contaminated bedding, and the apparent immunity of seasoned residents compared to newcomers. The response from the international scientific community was, at best, dismissive. Many physicians held fast to the fomite theory, the belief that contaminated bedding, clothing, or household goods carried the infection. This was not a frivolous idea. It matched experiences of outbreaks following the arrival of ships and their cargo, and it fit with centuries of thinking about miasmas and contagion embedded in objects. To suggest that a mosquito was the culprit seemed implausible, even ridiculous to many. For the next 20 years, Finley worked largely in isolation, conducting experiments and writing papers, most of which failed to persuade skeptics. He tried to show transmission by releasing mosquitoes that had fed on yellow fever patients to bite volunteers. The results were inconclusive. Some individuals became ill, but many did not. Critics argued that his evidence was anecdotal, inconsistent, or contaminated by chance exposures. Without laboratory proof of a causative agent, Finley's mosquito hypothesis languished at the margins of medical respectability. Despite this, Finley persisted. He published more than 40 papers on the mosquito theory. He carefully described the life cycle of Aedes aegypti and pointed out its habit of breeding in water containers in urban settings. He emphasized the timing between a mosquito feeding on an infected patient and its ability to transmit disease, noting that some interval seemed necessary for the insect to become infectious, a detail that later experiments would confirm as the extrinsic incubation period of the virus inside the mosquito. In Cuba, his ideas circulated, sometimes with respect, often with skepticism. Among local physicians, Finley had both admirers and detractors. His persistence, however, kept the hypothesis alive long enough for circumstances to shift. The broader medical world, meanwhile, offered few better explanations. Yellow fever defied containment by quarantine or disinfection of cargo. Outbreaks devastated port cities, crippled commerce, and killed thousands. The Panama Railroad project in the mid-19th century had been nearly ruined by yellow fever and malaria. The disease's unpredictability, combined with its lethality, made it one of the most dreaded afflictions of the Americas. By the 1890s, bacteriology was ascendant. The discovery of the tubercle bacillus, the cholera vibrio, and other pathogens had convinced many physicians that every disease would soon be tied to a specific bacterium. A supposed yellow fever bacillus was even announced in 1897 by Italian bacteriologist Giuseppe Santarelli, who claimed to have isolated a microorganism he named Bacillus icteroides. Santarelli's claim briefly held sway and was considered by some to be conclusive. But others, including Walter Reed and U.S. Army surgeons, found Santarelli's evidence unconvincing. Efforts to reproduce his findings failed. Finley's mosquito theory, however, still languished. He had no definitive experimental proof, no pathogen in a culture dish, no microscope slide to show skeptics. The medical establishment continued to place faith in fomites, quarantine, and disinfection, even though these methods repeatedly failed to halt epidemics. The arrival of the United States Army in Cuba after 1898 changed the conditions. Havana, under U.S. military administration, became both a strategic foothold and a laboratory. With soldiers dying from yellow fever and with public health officials desperate for solutions, Reed and his commission were authorized to test hypotheses directly. And one of the first ideas they revisited was Finley's long-neglected mosquito theory. Reed himself met with Finley in Havana. Historical accounts describe their discussions as cordial, with Reed requesting mosquito eggs from Finley to use in his experiments. The commission took Finley's hypothesis seriously enough to structure controlled experiments around it. By combining his insight with rigorous methodology, they were able to demonstrate conclusively what Finley had argued for 2 decades, that the mosquito was the vector of yellow fever. Thus, by 1900, Finley's once-dismissed proposal had become the seed of a scientific revolution. The doubt that had clouded his career would lift, though not before years of ridicule and neglect. In retrospect, Finley's 1881 hypothesis stands as a milestone in epidemiology, a visionary idea that was proven only after others risked, and sometimes gave, their lives to confirm it. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was brief, lasting only a few months, but its aftermath in Cuba stretched into years. Spain, exhausted and militarily outmatched, ceded control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States under the Treaty of Paris. Although the treaty declared Cuba free and independent, in practice, the island was placed under U.S. military government until conditions allowed for Cuban self-rule. When American troops occupied Havana, they inherited not only the spoils of war, but also the city's long-standing public health crisis. Yellow fever had haunted Havana for centuries. From the early colonial period, the disease had periodically erupted in lethal epidemics. Foreigners were particularly vulnerable, often dying within days of arrival. Local residents, who were frequently exposed as children, had higher survival rates, though even they were not fully protected. The U.S. military administration quickly recognized that yellow fever posed as grave a threat as any enemy. It killed soldiers in their barracks, weakened the occupation force, and jeopardized American political aims. In 1898 and 1899, U.S. Army hospitals in Havana recorded high mortality among troops stationed there. Reports circulated in Washington that disease, not combat, was claiming the majority of American lives. At the center of the military health effort in Cuba was Major William Crawford Gorgas, a career Army physician who had distinguished himself during service in the South. Gorgas had survived yellow fever himself in the 1870s while stationed in the American South and had become Chief Sanitary Officer of Havana under U.S. rule. His responsibility was daunting: to bring order to a city with poor sanitation, inadequate sewage systems, and dense housing, all fertile grounds for disease. Gorgas and other Army medical officers were frustrated. Conventional methods, quarantine, fumigation of cargo, burning contaminated bedding, were costly and largely ineffective. Year after year, new cases of yellow fever appeared. The city's reputation as a pest hole threatened U.S. credibility and imperiled plans for future commercial expansion in the Caribbean. It was in this context that the U.S. Army Medical Department decided to create a special commission to investigate yellow fever scientifically. In May 1900, Surgeon General George M. Sternberg, himself a microbiologist with interests in infectious diseases, authorized the formation of what became known as the U.S. Army Yellow Fever Commission. The commission was composed of 4 members: Major Walter Reed, appointed as head of the group, a career Army physician with prior experience in bacteriology and pathology; Reed had studied medicine at the University of Virginia and Bellevue Hospital Medical College, and by 1900 had a reputation as both a clinician and a researcher. James Carroll, acting assistant surgeon, a British-born physician who had served in the Army for years and had worked closely with Reed at the Army Medical Museum. Aristides Agramont, a Cuban-born pathologist educated in New York, who had previously studied yellow fever and performed autopsies in Havana. His dual cultural identity positioned him as a bridge between American and Cuban perspectives. Jesse William Lazear, acting assistant surgeon, a Johns Hopkins trained physician with an interest in entomology, particularly mosquitoes. Their mission was clear but perilous: to determine, by experiment, the mode of transmission of yellow fever. The commission was charged with testing competing theories, the fomite theory versus the mosquito hypothesis, and with doing so under controlled scientific conditions. From the outset, the work was unprecedented in scope. No previous effort had been granted such official backing, resources, and authority. The U.S. Army, determined to protect its soldiers and consolidate its hold on Cuba, was willing to sponsor experiments that would have been unthinkable under civilian oversight alone. The commission arrived in Havana in the summer of 1900. Their base of operations was the military hospital known as Los Animas, where yellow fever patients were treated. The members began with careful observation, reviewing medical records, examining patients, and dissecting the assumptions that had dominated the field. Almost immediately, they revisited the work of Carlos J. Finley. Reed met personally with Finley, who provided mosquito eggs and explained his decades-old theory. Though Finley's evidence had been unconvincing to the world at large, his logic intrigued Reed. With Lazear's entomological expertise, the commission now had the means to conduct rigorous tests of Finley's idea. To carry out the experiments systematically, the commission soon recognized the need for a controlled environment. They selected a site outside Havana, away from the bustle of the city, and established what became known as Camp Lazear, named after Jesse Lazear after his untimely death during the experiments. At this camp, volunteers could be housed in carefully constructed buildings designed to test specific hypotheses. One allowing only mosquito exposure, another designed to maximize contact with potentially contaminated bedding and clothing. The commission's official mandate carried extraordinary implications. They were authorized not only to observe but also to expose human volunteers deliberately to suspected sources of infection. This placed the work squarely in the realm of human experimentation, a controversial practice even then. To mitigate criticism, the commission instituted written contracts for volunteers, documents in English and Spanish that explained the risks, promised payment, and attempted to secure genuine consent. In an era when medical paternalism was the norm, this was a significant and unusual step. The volunteers were drawn from multiple sources. Some were American soldiers stationed in Cuba, willing to risk illness in exchange for monetary compensation or out of a sense of duty. Others were recent Spanish immigrants, often poor, who agreed to participate for payment. In both groups, the decision carried mortal risk, though the extent of the danger was not fully understood by all at the time. The commission's task was complicated by the limitations of medical science circa 1900. The infectious agent of yellow fever was invisible to existing microscopes and could not be cultured in the laboratory. The very concept of viruses as distinct from bacteria was only just emerging. Thus, Reed and his colleagues could not rely on isolating or visualizing the pathogen. They had to infer its existence and mode of transmission from patterns of illness in volunteers. Despite these challenges, the commission pressed forward. Over the months of late 1900 and early 1901, they would conduct a series of experiments that clarified the role of the mosquito and disproved the fomite theory. But their work came at a personal cost. James Carroll fell gravely ill after allowing himself to be bitten by an infected mosquito. Jesse Lazear, too, was bitten and died of yellow fever in September 1900. Their sacrifices added urgency and weight to the commission's findings. By early 1901, the evidence was overwhelming. The mosquito was the vector of yellow fever. Bedding and clothing, despite repeated exposure, never produced a single case in controlled conditions. Only bites from mosquitoes that had previously fed on yellow fever patients transmitted the disease. The commission's findings were not merely scientific. They had immediate political and strategic significance. The U.S. military administration in Havana could now justify a radical change in public health policy. Instead of burning belongings and quarantining ships, officials would focus on eliminating mosquito breeding grounds, protecting patients from mosquito bites, and draining or oiling water containers around the city. Thus, the Commission's mandate, born out of military necessity and desperation, produced results that validated Finley's once ridiculed idea and opened the path toward the eradication of yellow fever from Havana. Their work, situated in the charged atmosphere of occupation and empire, reshaped the balance of power between disease and medicine in the tropics. By the late summer of 1900, the work of the Yellow Fever Commission had moved from observation into risk. If the mosquito theory was to be proven, someone had to be infected in a way that ruled out every other explanation. The men of the commission, bound by duty and the scientific spirit of the age, accepted that this might mean placing their own lives on the line. James Carroll was the first. Toward the end of August, he permitted himself to be bitten by a mosquito that had earlier fed on a patient in the acute stage of yellow fever. Within a short time, he fell ill. His fever rose rapidly, his body weakened, and jaundice set in. For days, he hovered near death. Carroll eventually survived, but the illness left him permanently frail. From that point until his death in 1907, his health was never the same. Yet the fact that a controlled mosquito bite had produced yellow fever was undeniable. Jesse William Lazear's story ended more grimly. A Johns Hopkins trained physician with a strong interest in entomology, Lazear maintained the Commission's mosquito colonies. In September 1900, he, too, was bitten by an infected mosquito. Soon after, he developed a violent case of yellow fever. His strength failed quickly, and on September 25th, at just 34 years old, he died. Whether his bite had been deliberate or accidental has never been fully settled. What is certain is that his death shocked his colleagues and gave a tragic weight to their investigations. The experimental camp outside Havana, established shortly after, was named Camp Lazear in his honor. Walter Reed himself did not undergo deliberate exposure. As leader of the commission, he focused on designing the experiments, ensuring they were controlled, and documenting the results. His responsibility was to preserve continuity, and by avoiding infection, he was able to guide the commission's work after Carroll's near-fatal illness and Lazear's death. Aristides Agramont, the Cuban-born member of the commission, also did not take part in mosquito exposures. He had already survived yellow fever years earlier and was thought immune. His role centered on pathology, examining the organs of victims and distinguishing yellow fever from other tropical diseases. The Commission's readiness to risk themselves reflected the medical culture of the time. Self-experimentation was considered honorable, a way of demonstrating integrity before asking others to participate. Yellow fever, however, was no mild disease. Mortality could reach half of those infected in some outbreaks, and victims endured fever, delirium, organ failure, and sometimes the gruesome black vomit of internal bleeding. To accept this risk knowingly was a profound act of courage. The results of these sacrifices were decisive. Carroll's survival, though costly to his health, and Lazear's death proved beyond doubt that the mosquito could transmit yellow fever. When these cases were combined with the later controlled trials at Camp Lazear, the evidence dismantled the fomite theory and confirmed Carlos Finley's long-neglected idea. The personal consequences were lasting. Carroll never regained his health and died only a few years later. Lazear was mourned as a scientific martyr. Reed himself did not live long beyond these events, dying in 1902 from complications of appendicitis. Only Agramont lived into old age, continuing to remind later generations of the risks his colleagues had taken. Through their self-experiments, the Commission turned Havana into the proving ground for a discovery that would change global health. Their courage, their suffering, and their losses provided the foundation for the new strategy of mosquito control that would soon eradicate yellow fever from the city. After the deaths and illnesses of James Carroll and Jesse Lazear, the Yellow Fever Commission knew that its work had reached a turning point. The personal sacrifices of its own members had already yielded powerful evidence. But for the theory to be accepted beyond dispute, the team needed structured, reproducible trials. It was not enough to rely on isolated cases. They required a controlled experimental setting where all other variables could be eliminated. For that purpose, the Commission created a dedicated experimental station outside Havana. The site, chosen for its relative isolation and open ground, allowed the investigators to design buildings specifically suited to their needs. It became known as Camp Lazear, named in memory of Jesse William Lazear, whose death had given the Commission's work its deepest gravity. The camp consisted of several specially constructed huts. Each hut was built with the aim of testing a different theory of transmission. One was designed for experiments with mosquitoes, fitted with screening and controlled access so that infected insects could be introduced safely. Another was set up as the ultimate test of the fomite theory. It was packed with bedding, clothing, and materials taken from yellow fever patients, many of them soiled and unwashed, to see whether such items could provoke infection. The Commission also took the unprecedented step of drawing up written contracts for its volunteers. In both Spanish and English, these documents laid out the purpose of the experiments, the risks of exposure, and the compensation to be provided. The contracts promised payment of $100 in US gold to those who participated, with additional sums if illness occurred. For Spanish immigrant laborers who made up many of the volunteers, this was a life-changing amount. For American soldiers, it was both an incentive and a matter of patriotic duty. The use of contracts was extraordinary for its time. In an era when most medical experiments were performed without any formal consent, the Commission's insistence on written agreements showed a level of ethical concern that stood out even then. While modern standards would still judge the risks unacceptable, the attempt to explain dangers and secure agreement represented a significant step toward what would later become informed consent in human research. At Camp Lazear, the experiments unfolded with stark clarity. In the infected clothing building, volunteers were instructed to sleep on sheets, blankets, and pillows taken directly from yellow fever wards. These items were sometimes stained with sweat, blood, or vomit. Volunteers even wore the nightclothes of yellow fever patients. They remained in this environment for days at a time. Yet, despite the unpleasant conditions, not one of these volunteers developed yellow fever. In the mosquito hut, by contrast, volunteers who were bitten by mosquitoes that had fed on yellow fever patients did become ill. The pattern was consistent. After an interval of about 12 days, the period required for the mosquito to incubate the virus, the insect could transmit the disease to a healthy volunteer. The experiments showed that mosquitoes freshly fed on patients did not immediately spread the disease, a detail that matched Finley's earlier suggestion of a necessary delay. The results at Camp Lazear dismantled the fomite theory once and for all. If contaminated bedding and clothing could not cause illness under the most direct and concentrated exposure imaginable, then they could not be responsible for outbreaks. Only the mosquito explained the cases that appeared in the camp. The volunteers themselves became part of history. Most were poor Spanish immigrants who had recently arrived in Cuba. They lived in simple quarters at the camp and were observed closely by the Commission. Many fell ill, though none of the experimental volunteers died during these trials. Their names did not achieve the fame of Reed, Carroll, or Lazear, but their willingness to endure risk under contract was essential to the scientific breakthrough. In addition to direct exposures, the Commission also carried out blood inoculation experiments. Volunteers were injected with small amounts of blood drawn from yellow fever patients in the early stages of illness. These inoculations could produce yellow fever, confirming that the infectious agent circulated in the blood. Further, when blood was passed through a filter fine enough to trap bacteria and then injected, the disease could still be transmitted. This provided strong indirect evidence that the agent was something smaller than bacteria, what would later be understood as a virus. Camp Lazear thus became the site where every competing explanation of yellow fever transmission was put to the test. The combination of mosquito bite experiments, blood inoculations, and failed fomite trials created a body of evidence too strong to ignore. By early 1901, the Commission had compiled results that convinced not only themselves but also the broader medical community. The success of Camp Lazear was made possible by the blending of bravery, rigor, and structure. The Commission honored Jesse Lazear by attaching his name to the camp. They honored their volunteers with contracts that recognized, however imperfectly, the risks being taken. and they honored Finley's once-dismissed idea by proving it under the most exacting conditions. From the quiet huts outside Havana came results that would change public health forever. The question of how yellow fever spread, argued over for centuries, was now answered. The disease was not carried by clothing or cargo. It was not a vapor, nor a mysterious environmental poison. It was the bite of a single species of mosquito. The experiments at Camp Lazear had shown, beyond doubt, that mosquitoes could transmit yellow fever. Yet the commission wanted to push further. They needed to know what exactly was being carried by the mosquito. Was the insect introducing some external poison from its saliva? Or was it transferring something from the blood of an infected person? To answer this, the team turned to direct inoculation with blood. Volunteers were recruited under the same contractual system used at the camp. They agreed to receive injections of blood taken from patients who were in the early, most infectious stages of yellow fever. The blood was drawn with care, handled immediately, and injected in carefully measured amounts into healthy subjects. Within a matter of days, some of those volunteers developed the fever. The result was clear. The infectious principle of yellow fever circulated in the blood. These inoculations carried enormous risk. Yellow fever was notorious for its unpredictability. Some cases ended in recovery after days of fever and weakness, while others spiraled into organ failure, black vomit, and death. Each injection was, for the volunteer, a gamble with his life. But in those experiments lay the possibility of understanding, and eventually controlling, the disease. The commission did not stop at simple blood transfers. They went further by passing yellow fever blood through filters made of porcelain, designed to trap bacteria. At the time, the germ theory of disease had already been firmly established. Tuberculosis, cholera, and plague had been traced to specific bacteria visible under the microscope. The expectation was that yellow fever, if it followed the same rule, would also be caused by a bacterium. But when filtered blood, supposedly cleared of all bacteria, was injected into volunteers, the disease still appeared. The infectious agent had passed through barriers that no known bacterium could penetrate. The conclusion was startling. Yellow fever was caused by something smaller than bacteria. The commission did not yet have the word virus in the modern sense. The term was sometimes used vaguely to describe any unseen poison or infectious principle. Yet their experiments placed yellow fever among a handful of diseases, such as tobacco mosaic in plants and foot and mouth in animals, that were known to be caused by filterable agents. These were the first steps toward the modern science of virology. In this way, the Havana experiments bridged two worlds. On one side stood the 19th century germ theory, rooted in the discovery of visible microbes. On the other side was the new 20th century vision of pathogens too small for microscopes but capable of devastating illness. Yellow fever was one of the diseases that carried medicine into this new frontier. The blood inoculation trials also settled a practical question: how long a patient remained infectious. The commission determined that during the first few days of illness, blood was capable of transmitting the disease. After that window, the risk declined. This discovery explained why outbreaks seemed to burn so quickly through populations and why mosquito control had to be swift and systematic. The volunteers who submitted to blood inoculation were often poor, recent immigrants from Spain or local Cubans who had little else to rely on but the modest sums promised in the commission's contracts. Their contributions were less visible than those of Carroll or Lazear, but no less vital. They provided the evidence that yellow fever was not spread by sweat, bedding, or mere contact, but by a living agent carried in blood and delivered through a mosquito's bite. For the commission, these results closed the circle. Mosquitoes did not create the disease. They served as the carriers. What they transferred from one person to another was a blood-borne agent invisible under the microscope but capable of surviving filtration. This understanding placed yellow fever at the dawn of a new era of medicine. By the end of 1900, the Yellow Fever Commission had produced a body of evidence that was systematic, repeatable, and undeniable. The old theories of miasma and fomites could no longer stand. The disease's secret was in the mosquito and in the blood. When the Yellow Fever Commission finished its experiments at Camp Lazear and returned to Washington with their findings, Havana remained burdened with fear. Outbreaks of yellow fever had defined the city's history. Families had lost generations to it, foreign sailors dreaded its docks, and trade routes had long been marked by quarantine zones. The Commission's work had revealed the agent of transmission, but proof in a laboratory camp was not the same as transformation in the life of a city. For that, the theory had to be put into action. The man who carried this responsibility was William Crawford Gorgas, a U.S. Army physician and sanitation officer. Gorgas had already made a name for himself by reducing yellow fever cases in Havana through general sanitation measures, cleaning streets, improving drainage, and removing waste. But he had done so while still working under the older miasma framework, believing that filth bred disease. Now, armed with the Commission's findings, he shifted his focus with precision. The mosquito was the enemy, and the city would become his battlefield. The campaign Gorgas launched in early 1901 was unlike anything Havana had ever seen. Teams of inspectors fanned out into neighborhoods, house by house. Their mission was to eliminate every source of stagnant water where the Aedes aegypti mosquito might breed. Buckets, barrels, cisterns, flower vases, and even discarded tin cans were targeted. Inspectors emptied, scrubbed, or covered them. Where standing water could not be removed, it was treated with oil, which spread across the surface in a thin film that suffocated mosquito larvae. The effort did not stop with water containers. Window screens were distributed and enforced in public buildings and homes, cutting off mosquitoes from the sick and the healthy alike. Patients with active yellow fever were placed under mosquito netting, both to protect them from new bites and to prevent insects from carrying the infection to others. Every case of fever was investigated, and every suspected breeding site was recorded. The campaign combined military efficiency with unrelenting persistence. At first, Gorgas met resistance. Many residents resented the intrusion of inspectors into their homes. The idea that mosquitoes caused yellow fever was still strange to the public. To Havana's poor, the sight of soldiers and sanitation officers pouring oil into household water supplies or overturning containers seemed more like harassment than protection. But as the months passed, results began to speak louder than doubt. By the summer of 1901, yellow fever cases were declining sharply. Neighborhoods once notorious for infection began reporting fewer and fewer patients. By 1902, Havana saw something it had not experienced in centuries: an end to endemic yellow fever. The disease that had shaped its identity since colonial times was gone. The success was not merely a local triumph. Havana was a hub of the Caribbean, a node in the web of global trade. The disappearance of yellow fever there meant safer travel for sailors, fewer quarantines in ports across the Americas, and renewed confidence in commerce. It also demonstrated to the world that the mosquito theory was not just correct but practical. Disease control was possible. For Gorgas himself, the Havana campaign was the defining proof of concept that would later carry him to even greater responsibility. When the United States undertook the construction of the Panama Canal, plagued by yellow fever and malaria, it was Gorgas who applied the lessons of Havana on a grander scale. His mosquito control methods became a model for tropical medicine worldwide. The Havana campaign also reshaped the role of public health. No longer was it enough to clean streets and hope for better air. Control of specific vectors became central to disease prevention. The city became a laboratory of applied science, where theory and experiment translated into daily practice that saved lives. The Yellow Fever Commission had proven the mechanism. Gorgas had proven that knowledge could be turned into power. Together, they had ended a centuries-old scourge in one of the cities most haunted by it. By 1901, Havana had been transformed. The Yellow Fever Commission had delivered its evidence, and William Gorgas had demonstrated that applying mosquito control could extinguish the disease from a city once defined by it. Yet, for these findings to matter beyond the Caribbean, they needed recognition from the broader medical and political worlds. Science does not always move at the pace of discovery, and in the case of yellow fever, acceptance came slowly and unevenly. The Commission published its findings in American medical journals, presenting data from Camp Lazear and the blood inoculation experiments. Their reports were striking in their clarity. Tables showed volunteers who had slept on soiled bedding and remained healthy, while others, bitten by carefully timed mosquitoes, developed unmistakable cases of yellow fever. The inclusion of written contracts, rare in medical literature of the time, underscored the seriousness of their method. In the United States, the results were greeted with a mix of admiration and skepticism. Some physicians who had long believed in fomites resisted the idea that insects could carry such a fearsome disease. The fomite theory had deep roots not only in medical thought but also in commercial policy. Quarantine regulations, cargo fumigation, and trade restrictions had been built upon the belief that goods carried infection. Accepting the mosquito theory meant rethinking decades of practice in shipping and commerce. Cuba, however, could not ignore what had been achieved. For centuries, yellow fever had plagued Havana, shaping its social life, its economy, and its reputation. With the disease gone after Gorges's campaign, the evidence was visible to everyone who lived there. Ships arrived without sparking epidemics. Families no longer feared the summer season. The absence of death was more convincing than any journal article. The recognition spread outward. Ports around the Caribbean began to pay attention. In Veracruz, Mexico, and in ports of Central America, public health officers studied the Havana model. The same was true in Brazil, where cities like Rio de Janeiro faced their own relentless battles with yellow fever. Some regions adopted mosquito control measures directly, while others hesitated, caught between old habits and new science. International medical congresses provided the stage for the debate. American physicians who had worked in Cuba presented the mosquito theory abroad. European doctors listened with interest, but acceptance was cautious. The idea of a filtrable agent, transmitted by insects, seemed too radical to many who still relied on the visible certainties of bacteriology. Even as late as 1903, some medical authorities in Europe dismissed the findings as unproven. The turning point came not from persuasion but from results. When yellow fever disappeared from Havana, the shipping world noticed. Quarantine restrictions were relaxed. Ports once infamous for infection became safer. Insurance costs declined. Traders who had once suffered heavy losses due to quarantines and disease outbreaks now saw prosperity return. Economic proof reinforced medical proof. In this way, the mosquito theory moved from a contested idea to an accepted truth. The Commission's evidence, Gorges's campaign, and the lived experience of healthier cities combined to push aside the older theories. By the early years of the new century, the world began to acknowledge what had once been dismissed. Carlos Finley had been right, the Commission had confirmed it, and Havana had proven it in practice. This recognition also marked a new era for medicine. The success in Havana showed that tropical diseases could be defeated not by vague sanitation or luck, but by precise intervention against vectors. It was a shift from reactive medicine to preventive public health, from treating patients to controlling environments. Yellow fever became the symbol of this transformation. The influence of the Havana findings extended far beyond the Americas. European colonial powers, managing territories in Africa and Asia where mosquito-borne diseases were rampant, took note. In cities like Lagos, Dakar, and Calcutta, discussions began about whether mosquito control might hold the key to protecting both colonizers and local populations. The lessons of Havana would echo in distant climates, preparing the ground for broader battles against malaria and other tropical scourges. By the time the 20th century advanced into its first decade, the mosquito was no longer an invisible nuisance. It was a recognized enemy of human health. The Commission's work, once experimental and uncertain, had become the foundation of a new global strategy. At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States took over one of the most ambitious engineering projects in the world, the Panama Canal. For decades, nations had dreamed of cutting a waterway through the Isthmus of Panama, linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The French, under Ferdinand de Lesseps, had attempted it in the 1880s. Their effort ended in disaster. Tens of thousands of workers died, largely from yellow fever and malaria, and the project collapsed in bankruptcy and scandal. When the United States assumed control in 1904, the engineering challenges were immense, but the medical challenges were greater still. The Isthmus was infamous as a white man's graveyard. Camps of laborers suffered constant fevers. Hospitals overflowed. Fear of yellow fever was so widespread that recruitment of workers was nearly impossible. Few men were willing to risk their lives in a place so deadly. Into this environment stepped William Crawford Gorgas, now Surgeon General of the U.S. Army and already recognized for his success in Havana. Gorgas carried with him the lessons of the Yellow Fever Commission and the Mosquito War in Cuba. He believed firmly that if yellow fever could be eliminated in Havana, it could also be eliminated in Panama. The task, however, was far more daunting. Havana was a single city, with a defined population and an administrative structure that allowed for systematic control. Panama was a vast construction zone stretching for miles through jungles, swamps, and river valleys. The mosquito, not confined to urban neighborhoods, bred in countless pools of water scattered across the landscape. To apply the Havana model in Panama required resources, manpower, and persistence on a scale never before attempted. At first, Gorgas faced skepticism. Engineers and administrators viewed his proposals as expensive distractions. They remembered that the French had tried sanitation campaigns and still failed. Some saw mosquitoes as a minor nuisance, not the cause of death and despair. But Gorgas persisted. He insisted that no canal could be built until the diseases were controlled. Gradually, his campaign took shape. Teams were organized to drain swamps, clear brush, and spread oil on standing water. Ditches were dug to improve drainage. Houses, barracks, and hospitals were screened with fine wire mesh. Every patient with fever was placed under mosquito netting. Inspections were constant, and entire neighborhoods were subject to systematic search for breeding grounds. The work was exhausting and often unpopular. Laborers resented the constant intrusion, just as Cubans had in Havana. But the results became visible. Within 2 years, yellow fever disappeared from the canal zone. The last recorded case occurred in 1905. For a region once cursed with a reputation of deadly fever, this was nothing short of miraculous. Malaria, more persistent than yellow fever, proved harder to control, but even here Gorgas's methods brought dramatic improvement. By reducing mosquito breeding grounds, insisting on bed nets, and treating cases aggressively, the death toll declined. The canal, once thought impossible because of disease, became feasible. The global impact of this success cannot be overstated. The Panama Canal was one of the great engineering triumphs of the 20th century. Its completion in 1914 transformed world trade, linking oceans, shortening routes, and shifting geopolitical power. Behind that triumph stood the medical victory achieved by Gorgas and rooted in the discoveries of the Yellow Fever Commission. Without control of yellow fever, no canal would have been possible. Recognition followed. Gorgas was hailed as a hero of preventive medicine. His mosquito control methods became models for colonial administrations, military outposts, and international health campaigns. The mosquito, once dismissed as a mere annoyance, was now regarded as one of humanity's most dangerous enemies. The legacy of the Panama Canal extended beyond engineering and medicine. It symbolized a new confidence that science could master even the most daunting challenges of nature. The canal could not have been carved without dredges, dynamite, and machinery, but it also could not have been carved without mosquito netting, oiling cans, and the relentless discipline of sanitation squads. The lesson was clear. Knowledge gained in Havana had reshaped the health of the tropics and opened the way for one of the century's defining achievements. Yellow fever had been tamed, not by chance, but by deliberate application of discovery to practice. When the work of the Yellow Fever Commission ended and William Gorgas's campaigns had proven their worth in Havana and Panama, the world had crossed a threshold. The conquest of yellow fever was more than the solution to one disease. It represented the moment when medicine showed it could not only explain illness but also transform entire societies by preventing it. The immediate legacy was practical. In Havana, a city once scarred by constant outbreaks, yellow fever vanished. In Panama, a canal once doomed by disease became a triumph of engineering. Across the Americas, ports were freed from the fear of quarantine. Commerce flowed more easily, and migration became safer. Families no longer lived under the shadow of seasonal epidemics. The broader legacy lay in the way medicine was practiced. The Yellow Fever Commission's experiments showed the value of rigorous, controlled investigation. They dismantled centuries of speculation about miasmas and contagion clinging to clothing. They proved that disease could be tracked with precision, tested in carefully designed environments, and explained by biological mechanisms. The scientific method, applied with discipline and courage, had solved a riddle that had cost countless lives. Yet the legacy was also written in human sacrifice. James Carroll lived out his final years in frail health because he had chosen to let an infected mosquito bite him. Jesse Lazear gave his life after his own exposure. Walter Reed, who coordinated and protected the structure of the work, died only 2 years later, though not from yellow fever. Aristides Agramont, who survived his colleagues, became a living reminder of their courage. Their names became symbols, inscribed on monuments, hospitals, and medical schools. Ethically, their work stood at a crossroads. On the one hand, their use of written contracts with volunteers at Camp Lazear was a remarkable innovation for its time, a step toward what would later become the principle of informed consent. On the other hand, the risks were extreme by modern standards. Volunteers were often poor immigrants, and although they signed contracts, the imbalance of power and knowledge between doctors and subjects was significant. Modern medicine would later wrestle with these questions, developing stronger safeguards, but the Commission's efforts marked an early recognition that human experimentation required acknowledgement of responsibility. Scientifically, the discovery that yellow fever was transmitted by a mosquito carrying an agent smaller than bacteria placed the disease at the birth of virology. The concept of a filterable virus was still in its infancy, yet here was one of the first demonstrations of such an agent in human disease. Yellow fever became one of the earliest viral illnesses to be understood, laying the groundwork for the later discovery of viruses like polio, influenza, and HIV. Public health, too, was transformed. Gorgas's campaigns showed that disease could be prevented by systematic control of vectors. His work influenced malaria control, the design of urban sanitation programs, and the strategies of international health organizations. The idea that controlling the environment could protect populations became a guiding principle of 20th century public health. The legacy also belonged to Carlos Finley. For 2 decades, his theory had been dismissed. But when the Commission and Gorgas proved him right, his reputation was restored. He was honored in Cuba and abroad as the visionary who first saw the truth. His persistence, despite rejection, became a lesson in the long struggle between discovery and acceptance. By the middle of the 20th century, vaccines and insecticides added new weapons against yellow fever. Outbreaks continued in some parts of the world, particularly in Africa and South America, but the terror that once defined Havana, New Orleans, and Panama was gone. What had once seemed an unstoppable scourge had been turned into a manageable disease. The story of the Yellow Fever Commission endures not only in history books but also in the ethos of medicine. It is remembered as a moment when individuals risked everything to prove a truth, when science advanced through both brilliance and bravery, and when the fate of cities and nations turned on the bite of a mosquito. The huts of Camp Lazear no longer stand, but their memory remains as a symbol of medical courage. The canals of Panama still carry ships across oceans, their waters a monument not only to engineering but also to the conquest of disease. And the names of Reed, Carroll, Lazear, Agramont, Gorgas, and Finley remain tied to a turning point when humanity learned that knowledge, tested and applied, could conquer even the most ancient of plagues. The story of the Yellow Fever Commission reminds us that progress often demands courage, sacrifice, and unshakable belief in discovery. From Havana to Panama and beyond, their work changed medicine and saved countless lives. If you found this journey through history powerful, make sure to subscribe to Eternal Obsidian for more stories that reveal the hidden struggles and triumphs behind the world we know today. And don't forget, drop your thoughts in the comments. What part of this story struck you most? Until next time, this is Eternal Obsidian, where history's darkest trials shine with timeless lessons.